Yeah, we've had snow all week, and we got about 6 inches, but the wind's been blowing so hard that every time we plow our driveway, it just fills right back in. We live kind of off a hill, and the wind just kind of, the wind and the snow just kind of comes down the hill. It's really kind of fun. So here we go. Let's talk about let's talk about hormones in the brain. It's kind of a fun chapter. It is for me anyway. Maybe not so much for you, but we'll see. Animals use several types of chemical signals in the body to communicate or deliver information. Neurocrine, synaptic communication, goes neuro meaning neuron. Autocrine, hormones activating the releasing gland, and we're going to show an example of that in just a second. Paracrine, hormone targeting nearby cells. Endocrine, hormone passing through the blood to a distant target. And then pheromones, which communicate between individuals. So let's go ahead and show that. Neurocrine communication is synaptic communication. This communication is highly localized. Autocrine is in a autocrine cell. The secreted hormone is released by the cell and then finds receptors on their own cell to attach to. Paracrine cells release a chemical communicator that affects a nearby target cell. The strongest impacts are nearby cells. Then, of course, we understand the endocrine system. Endocrine communication is through the release of a hormone into the bloodstream. The blood takes the hormonal signal to distant targeted organs where the hormone changes the function of the targeted organ. And a good example would be the pituitary gland releasing a hormone that affects the pancreas and tells it to release sugar. Pheromones are hormones released into the environment that are carried from their originator to another individual of the same species. Human females may release pheromones that regulate their menstrual cycles. We have seen examples of that. We've seen dogs sniffing things and then urinating on things. What are they doing? They're trying to communicate with other animals. Other dogs, of course, not other animals, but other dogs as to what their territory is. Allomones are chemical signals that are released by one species and affect a member of another species. Flowers will release allomones to attract insects that will carry their pollen to another plant of their species. Hormones frequently act in a gradual fashion. Behavioral and physical responses occur only after weeks of treatment and may last for several days. When hormones do alter behavior, they tend to act by changing the intensity or probability of a behavior. They do not act as a switch. The quantities and types of hormones released are influenced by environmental as well as internal factors. High levels of testosterone cause aggressive behavior. The most aggressive individual wins an encounter and maintains their testosterone level, while the loser suffers a lowering of testosterone after the encounter. Each hormone has multiple effects on the different tissue, organs, and behavior. Conversely, a single type of behavior or physiological change can be affected by many different hormones. Hormones are produced in small amounts and are secreted in bursts. Pulsating patterns are sometimes crucial for the small amount of hormone to be effective. Levels of many hormones vary rhythmically throughout the day. Many hormonal systems are controlled by circadian clocks in the brain. Circadian means around the day. Circa means around, and dia means day. Around the day, circadian clocks. Hormones affect the metabolic process in most cells and induce long-term metabolic change through the buildup and breakdown of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Hormones interact. The effects of one hormone can be markedly changed by the actions of another hormone. The chemical structure of a given hormone is similar in all vertebrates. The functions served across species can vary. Hormones can affect only cells that possess a receptor protein that recognizes the hormone and alters cell function. In different vertebrates, the same brain regions often possess the same hormone receptors. Neural communication works somewhat like an old wired telephone or telegraph system. Messages travel over fixed channels to precise destinations. The structure of the connections between neurons determines the transmission of information from one cell to another. Once upon a time, when I was born in the 1950s, the only way that a telephone worked was through a wire. And so we had all these wires running all over the place. They were running to your house, and that way you could call out, use your telephone to call people around the United States or around the world. But there had to be wires that connected you to that person. So your telephone was attached to a telephone pole, and the telephone pole ran down the road, and it ran to the next town. And in that next town, there were more wires that attached to the next town, and the next town, and the next town. And that's how the telephone system used to work. And that's one of the reasons why telephones used to be attached to the wall. Now they communicate through satellites. So our telephones, our cell phones, are connected to satellites that are up in the air. And of course, you bounce your signal off the satellite, and the satellite will connect you with whoever it is you want to talk to. It's a lot cheaper than running all those wires. Endocrine communication works like a television broadcasting system. Hormones are broadcast in the blood, and any number of scattered receptors throughout the body receive the message and respond to it. And that's the way televisions work. You have a television station, it broadcasts the signal, and if you've got a receptor, a television set, it will accept that information from the television station. Now, telephones don't work that way. It's not that everybody can receive your message, because your message is specific. So it bounces off the satellite and goes to a specific telephone. Neural messages are very rapid and are measured in milliseconds. Hormonal messages are slow and are measured in seconds or even minutes. Most neural messages are all or none responses. Hormonal messages are analog, graded in strength by the amount of hormone released. Neural responses are very often voluntary, while hormonal responses are not. Both systems store chemical transmitters for future release. Both systems are stimulated to respond by an outside source. Both systems are quite complex and maintain many different chemical transmitters. Some hormones used by the endocrine system are also produced by neurons and used as transmitters. Both systems use transmitters that have specific receptors on the receiving target cells that respond to the stimulation. Both systems may produce a second messenger response in the targeted cells that brings about two levels of changes at the same time. There are three categories of hormones: protein hormones, amine hormones, and steroid hormones. Protein hormones are composed of strings of amino acids. Amine hormones are composed of a single amino acid. Steroid hormones are composed of four interconnected rings of carbon atoms rather than amino acids. Hormones promote the proliferation, growth, and differentiation of cells. Thyroid hormones present at birth support brain development and growth. And if you have a deficit of those, then the individual will have a condition known as cretinism, where their brain hasn't fully developed. Hormones modulate cell activity. Gonadal hormones modulate the onset and the maintenance of secondary sexual characteristics with puberty. And if you remember your own puberty, then you remember that there was a vast change between the child that you were and the adult that you became. and that change was modulated by hormones. Protein hormones and most amine hormones bind the receptor molecules on the surface of target cell membranes. This releases a second messenger in the cell. Because of the rapid process of protein binding, protein and amine hormones tend to act rapidly. Steroid hormones must pass through the cell membrane and bind to a specific receptor protein inside the cell. The combined steroid receptor complex then binds to the DNA inside the nucleus. The effect of gene expression may increase the production of some proteins and decrease others. And here is a video talking about second messenger systems. Oops.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of cAMP from ATP. The cAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
Hi, high school parents. I'm Rob Franek. I'm editor-in-chief here at the Princeton Review.
Wow. Okay. And that's the second messenger system. You can see how complex it is. Most of the hormonal systems in the endocrine system control themselves through a negative feedback system. A gland detects a need to produce the hormone is produced, of course. The need is taken care of. The gland is no longer stimulated by the need. The gland produces only enough hormone to take care of the level of the need. And that's known as a negative feedback system. Insulin's negative feedback loop: glucose from a meal enters the bloodstream. The increased glucose triggers the pancreas to produce more insulin. The insulin enables the cells of the body to utilize the glucose for energy. As the level of glucose in the blood decreases, the pancreas is stimulated to produce less and less insulin. A balance is maintained. The pituitary gland rests in a depression in the skull directly behind the nasal cavity. The pituitary gland consists of 2 parts. The anterior pituitary is constructed of glandular tissue, and the posterior, the back part, pituitary, is constructed of neural tissue. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by a thin piece of tissue called the pituitary stalk. The axons of the hypothalamus reach into the pituitary gland, but only in the posterior pituitary. The axons from the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin and arginine vasopressin. Because of the vascular structure of the posterior pituitary, both oxytocin and vasopressin are rapidly released into the bloodstream. Vasopressin is also known as antidiuretic hormone. This hormone helps conserve water by inhibiting the formation of urine in the kidneys. It is stimulated by areas in the supraoptic and paraventricular nucleuses that detect thirst and water needs. Oxytocin also is produced by the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin stimulates the contraction of the uterine wall that speeds up childbirth. Oxytocin also triggers the contraction of the cells in the mammary glands that allows the milk to be released from the breasts. Because the process takes 30 to 60 seconds, the experienced mother will begin responding to her child's cries rather than the suckling. In other words, her breast will start leaking milk. While oxytocin allows other animals to reproduce, in humans it mediates sexual arousal and affection response. The anterior pituitary is made up of glandular cells rather than neural cells as the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is controlled by releasing hormones produced in the hypothalamus and are transported to the anterior pituitary through the network of capillaries called the hypothalamic pituitary portal system. The neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus that produce the releasing hormones are controlled by two influences. They receive neural impulses from other parts of the hypothalamus that either inhibit or excite their releasing capacity. Circulating messages from other hormones directly affect them. Corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, that stimulates the adrenal glands to produce corticosteroids. The adrenal glands, of course, are on top of the kidneys. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone, TRH, stimulates the pituitary gland to produce thyroid-stimulating hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Prolactin-releasing peptide and prolactin-inhibiting factor are produced by the hypothalamus to control the amount of prolactin released from the pituitary gland. Prolactin controls lactation in women. Somatocrinin stimulates and somatostatin inhibits are produced by the hypothalamus to stimulate the pituitary gland to produce growth hormone, which controls bone growth. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone is produced by the hypothalamus, which stimulates the pituitary gland to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. In the female, LH luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of ova from the ovaries and prepares the uterine wall for implantation. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates secretion of estrogen and influences ova production. In the male, luteinizing hormone stimulates the testes to produce testosterone, and follicle-stimulating hormone influences sperm production. So as we can see, both are very necessary in males and females, and it has to do with reproduction in both. The adrenal glands are situated on top of each kidney. Like the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands are divided into two portions: the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla releases the amine hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex produces and secretes some of the steroid hormones, the adrenocorticoids. The glucocorticoids affect the metabolism of carbohydrates. Cortisol is an example of a glucocorticoid. The second group of adrenal steroids is the mineralocorticoids, which affect the ion concentration of sodium in the kidneys. Aldosterone acts on the kidneys to reduce urine output and conserve sodium, thus also conserving water. The adrenal cortex also produces sex steroids. The chief sex steroid produced by the adrenal cortex is androstenedione, the steroid that Mark McGwire was using when he broke the Major League home run record. Androstenedione contributes to adult hair growth patterns in men and women. An overabundance in a woman can lead to a more masculine hair growth pattern, such as the pubic hair growing up to her navel. And that is what we're talking about here. She's got a unibrow, and she's got hair growing around her ear. The adrenocortical hormones are controlled by ACT. I didn't show you any pubic hair growing up to a woman's navel. Sorry. The adrenocortical hormones are controlled by ACTH released from the pituitary gland. Stress is detected by the hypothalamus, and it releases corticotropin releasing hormone to induce the pituitary to release ACTH. Unfortunately, the glucocorticoids released because of the ACTH, when released in high levels, can kill nerve cells in the hippocampus, which means your memory. The more stress hormones you have, the poorer your memory, because you're killing nerve cells in your hippocampus. The thyroid gland is located around the esophagus just below the voice box. 3 hormones secreted from the thyroid include thyroxine, also known as T4, and triiodothyronine, T3, and calcitonin. The hormones are stored in the thyroid colloid, which is the mass of the thyroid. The thyroid maintains a large supply of hormones, about 100 days worth. Calcitonin promotes calcium use in the bones. T4 and T3 levels are regulated by TSH released by the anterior pituitary. T3 and T4 are amines, but act as steroids, passing through the cell membrane, finding a receptor in the cell, and then binding to the DNA. T3 and T4 are released from the thyroid gland because of the influence of TSH from the pituitary, which is induced to release TSH when stimulated by thyrotropin releasing hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. The thyroid hormones are critically dependent on iodine. An inadequate supply of iodine will lead to hypothyroidism. Since the thyroid output is inadequate, the pituitary produces more and more TSH to compensate, but only succeeds in enlarging the thyroid in a condition known as goiter. In the United States, this is combated with iodized salt. And that's what a goiter looks like. That's an expansion of this individual's thyroid gland because they didn't get enough iodine. Now, this problem has been very common inland from the sea, and this may be one of the reasons why humans have lived close to the ocean for an extended length of time. If they moved away from the sea and weren't getting enough iodine, then they developed goiters. And here's an example of what happened. My mother had to live through all this stuff because we're from Indiana. Indiana's not connected to the ocean. As a matter of fact, it's hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away from any saltwater fishes or anything. Until 1924, goiter was endemic in areas of the United States where iodine from seafood was not prevalent. In Michigan, a study, and remember, Michigan is surrounded by fresh water, so the fish that people in Michigan would eat wouldn't have enough iodine to do anything for them. In Michigan, a study in 1923 showed 39% prevalence rate among school children. 39%. That's 1 out of every 3 had goiter. In Ohio, 31% of the school children were estimated to have goiter. In West Virginia, goiter was rare as long as local brown salt was being used. Why is it brown? Because it's got iodine in it. When pure white salt replaced the brown, a 1922 study showed 61% of the school children had enlarged thyroid glands. And since you live in Arizona and New Mexico, eat iodized salt. Use iodized salt. As a fetus is developing, if the thyroid hormones are not high enough, they will cause stunted growth, facial malformations, and a reduction in brain size. The baby will also suffer from intellectual disability in a condition known as cretinism because their brain hasn't developed because of thyroid hormone malfunction. The male gonads are the two testes located in a sac beneath the penis. Each testis produces millions of sperm a day through Sertoli cells. In and among the Sertoli cells are Leydig cells, which secrete testosterone. These are the Leydig cells, and these are the Sertoli cells. Sertoli cells produce sperm. Testosterone and other androgens are regulated by luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. Luteinizing hormone is controlled by the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The female gonads are the ovaries. They are located above the vagina at the very bottom of the abdominal cavity. There are two ovaries, one on each side of the uterus. The ovaries produce progestins and estrogens. The most important estrogen is estradiol. The primary progestin is progesterone. Estrogens trigger the production of progestin receptors in the brain. Hence, with puberty, progestin sensitivity ushers in the menstrual cycle after estrogen is secreted from the ovaries. All three sex hormones, androgens, estrogens, and progestins, have a similar chemical structure, 4 interconnected carbon rings. The sex hormones, along with the adrenal steroids, are derived from cholesterol. Estrogens are synthesized from androgens, and androgens are synthesized from progestins. Both males and females have the same sex hormones, only in different proportions. Unlike most brain structures, which are paired, there is only one pineal gland. It lays on the top of the brainstem. The pineal gland produces the amine hormone melatonin. Melatonin receptors are metabotropic, thus they activate G proteins, and therefore they're slow. Since melatonin activates metabotropic receptors, reaction to it is very slow. Melatonin regulates the circadian rhythm and the reaction to light and dark. Melatonin can be used to move the sleep cycle up in the night, but because it has a metabotropic receptor, it only works over time. The pancreas serves two main functions. It produces digestive enzymes, and as an endocrine gland, it secretes insulin and glucagon. The endocrine gland portion of the pancreas is a series of specialized cells called islets of Langerhans. Islets of Langerhans. Both glucagon and insulin affect glucose utilization by the body's cells. The peptide hormone insulin is produced in beta cells within the islets of Langerhans, while glucagon is produced in alpha cells of the islets. When glucose rises to a select point, insulin is released into the bloodstream. The insulin induces the cells to use more glucose and reduces the amount of glucose being released by the liver, lowering the blood sugar level. Glucagon serves the opposite purpose of insulin. When the pancreas detects a low blood sugar level, glucagon is released and it induces the liver to release glycogen. There is a paracrine action between the alpha and the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. And that is it. I'll talk to you next week.